What experiences did C.S. Lewis have in his childhood that shaped his later life? What people, books, and early experiences shaped his thinking, his conversion, and his writing career? Our guest today, Dr. Harry Lee Poe, who's been on the show before to talk about the conversion of C.S. Lewis, authored another book called Becoming C.S. Lewis, which talks about kind of the untold story of the life of C.S. Lewis. So many of the things in this book, Dr. Poe, just surprised me and were eye-opening and illuminating about his story. But here's what you wrote. One of the goals is, quote, to show that the habits and preferences of a lifetime often form during adolescence or before. And this was certainly the case with C.S. Lewis. Now, tell us in this book what ages you cover in his life and why.
This book focuses on Lewis's life from about the age of 9 until about the age of 19. From the time his mother died of cancer until the end of World War I, where he served on the battlefields of France. Now, it's an accidental book. I had not planned on writing it. Um, I'd been working on Lewis and just kept running into him talking about how much he liked to eat. But I didn't know what he liked to eat. And so curiosity drove me to try and figure out what exactly would be a meal that C.S. Lewis really enjoyed. But I couldn't find it anywhere. I went to his letters and thought, well, maybe he tells us about
Mm.
his preferences in his letters. But it wasn't until the age of 16 and the morning after he arrived at Great Bookham, where he lived for a couple of years with a private tutor, that he went down to breakfast, and Mrs. Kirkpatrick had baked what he called good old fashioned Irish soda bread. So this young Irishman, far away in an unknown land of England, was eating something familiar to him. So, soda bread. But by the time I'd gotten through so many letters to get him up to the age of 16, I realized that so many of the um, preferences, the likes, the dislikes, the interests of Lewis were formed by the time he was
Mm.
16 years old. And I think this says something very important for us in the church today, not just, oh, isn't C.S. Lewis interesting, but what are we doing with our children and teenagers in terms of our church's ministries to them? It's incredibly important. And I think youth ministry in particular is in a difficult time right now. And I think it's something that can't be left to just the person you hire to do youth ministry. It's
Mm.
something all the adults in the church need to embrace and be a part of in helping to form the
Hmm.
interests, the preferences, the dislikes of teenagers.
That's a great connection. And you make a ton of these connections. You talk about how his love for animals starts early in his life. Some of the experiences that he had formed the Narnia series. If so much of his writing reflects these early experiences, why has the early years of C.S. Lewis been so neglected?
I think the main reason is because biographers have wanted to focus on his conversion and then his productivity as the
Hmm.
greatest apologist of the 20th century. Um, and they couldn't do both because publishers limit the number of pages they'll allow a writer to use. And
Hmm.
Crossway allowed me the space to dig deeper in Lewis than most biographies are able to do. My 3 volume biography of Lewis is essentially 3 times longer than any others. So that gave
Hmm.
me the space to tell stories that haven't been told before.
That makes sense. Now, you wrote this. You said, quote, Lewis thought of his boyhood as a desert characterized by greed, cruelty, noise, and the mundane. What do you mean by those characteristics of his boyhood?
Well, I'll have to tell you what I think he meant by those terms because
Okay.
that's the way he characterized it. And
Hmm.
think of what he meant by boyhood, what we would call um, late grammar school, middle school. um, the sixth grade through the ninth grade. Um, and he was distinguishing that from his interests as what we would call a high school student or an early grammar school student. Um, as a boy in first, second, third grades, his imagination was roaring along, and until the time he was 10 years old, he was still drawing pictures and making up stories of Animal Land. And so, in active imagination, he said that one of the problems with boyhood or those middle school years, um, children tend to become egocentric. It's
Mm.
the eve of puberty, and he said the kind of stories that he was reading and that were popular, that every boy his age were reading, were these boy hero stories,
Okay.
and they were being churned out by the ton from all the presses. You know, the boy hero who wins the battle and fights desperados and solves the mystery and all of that sort of thing. Um, and he said uh, it doesn't work the same way as younger children's stories of like Wind in the Willows, because those stories make the reader the hero and give the reader an inflated sense of their own importance and that
Hmm.
sort of thing. Um, so Lewis thought that period of his life was wasteland, and
Interesting.
I think I've been asking students for years in college and in seminary what they thought of their middle school years, and almost everybody looks back and just hated those years. Yes, it was, some people had a great time, but most people, it was a miserable time of
Hmm.
low self-esteem and trying to figure out what was expected and what does it mean to get older, and so it's a terrible time. And again, this goes back to the importance of a well thought out youth ministry,
Hmm.
because that early adolescent period is a time of just desperate struggling.
Now, most of us know C.S. Lewis as C.S. Lewis, but I didn't know the story behind his name. Talk about what he was called when he was younger and how he adopted the name C.S. Lewis.
Well, his given name was Clive Staples Lewis. Now, the Clive was a British Empire hero. Clive was the person that led British expansionism in India. And so at that time, remember, Lewis was born in 1898, the absolute pinnacle of power of the British Empire. The British fleet was, I think, something like 5 times the size of the next largest fleet. And the British Empire spread across a sixth of the Earth's land surface. And so that naming him after Clive would have been like an American naming a child George Washington or Benjamin Franklin in the 19th century. We don't do that anymore, but it
Wow.
was once common.
Hmm.
Staples was a family name, a last name, and from his mother's side, and his mother's family was more prominent socially than the Lewises were. The Lewises had come from Wales just a couple of generations before, and had risen from working class up to middle class. Um, Flora Lewis's family, the Hamiltons, were lesser gentry, um, and they named lesser nobility in her ancestors. Her grandfather was a bishop,
Okay.
and so they were related to people of prominence. And so that's what she wanted for her sons. She wanted her sons to rise in social prominence. So that was his name. He was stuck with Clive Staples Lewis, and he almost deserved it. Um, um, so as a tiny little boy, he popped up one time and told his father, "My name is Jaxie," and that was the name of a dog that they had. So he's named himself for a dog. And Jaxie soon became Jax, and then it was finally shortened to Jack. And later in life, when he was in his late teens and 20s, sometimes his father and brother, writing to one another, would continue to refer to him as Jax rather than Jack. Um, but that's how the name came about.
That's
And
really
he always called himself Jack to his friends, but in formal occasions, he was known as Clive. So, so his teachers would always refer to him as Clive,
ah.
and, um, and he would sometimes sign his letters Clive Lewis. Not very often, but from time to time in a more formal setting. Normally, um, uh, once he became 16, he signed his letters either C.S. Lewis or Jack.
Got it. Super, super interesting. Now, he went to a boarding school young, like it seemed like maybe 9 or 10 years old. He's heading to this boarding school, and I might be pronouncing it wrong, so correct me if I do. It's called Wynyard. What was it
Yes.
like? And if I understood your comparison, you kind of compared it to a concentration camp for him that was just a miserable experience.
Um, and again, I don't, but he did.
Oh, it was
Um,
his. Okay.
he referred to it as a concentration camp, and in
Hmm.
Surprised by Joy, he gave fictitious names to a lot of people and a lot of places, and so he didn't call it Wynyard School. He called it Belsen, which in fact was a German concentration camp. Um, the headmaster of this school, and it was a small, struggling school in Watford, which is a small market town north of London. Um, the headmaster had been certified insane by the courts a year or so before Lewis got there, but apparently that had nothing to do with him being allowed to continue to beat children. And his teaching technique, he taught math. And his technique was if you got the answer wrong, he would beat you with his cane. If you got the answer right, he would beat you with his cane. And it was just a dreadful situation. And
Jeez.
Lewis, at this time, still had a strong Irish accent. His mother wanted the boys to go to school in England to get rid of their Irish accents because she saw that as a handicap to their advancement socially and professionally. And it's you may be able to tell that I have a Southern accent, and in the United States, a Southern accent is a handicap to progress.
Interesting.
Yeah, if
Hmm.
you're going to be a television commentator, you have to have a Midwest accent, that neutral diphthong. But anyway, um, at that time, this was before World War One. The English had a strong prejudice against the Irish, and that continues to this day. But then
Hmm.
it was much more virulent. And you would think that the English would like the Irish Protestants and dislike the Irish Catholics. But religion had nothing to do with it. If you were Irish, you were less than human. And it didn't matter if you were Protestant or Catholic. And so Lewis was ostracized by the boys from southern England. Here's a little boy speaking, 10 years old, writing to uh, his father and writing in his diary. And his view was that the farther south an English person came from, the more despicable they were. If they got up close to northern York and almost to Scotland, they were fairly tolerable. But then they had very strong accents in the north of England, and so they would have been
Gotcha.
picked upon. But the headmaster treated the Irish boys rather cruelly, and so
Hmm.
it was a bad time, and until his father finally took him out.
So just so I understand, when he's 9 or 10 years old, he's shipped away for months lives there, and then only comes home summer and maybe like Christmas holidays.
Yes.
Wow, at a young age. That's amazing. Now you've mentioned a few times that he's Irish. That surprised me in your book. Maybe I just missed that. I always assumed he was British, but
Hmm.
he's Irish.
He's
How did
Irish.
that shape him? Why does that matter to his story?
Well, I think, and he'll refer to it from time to time in letters. He always had that sense of being Irish, and there's a certain romance to the Irish countryside.
Hmm.
And he grew up a few miles from what's known as the Giant's Causeway. It's a fascinating geological formation um, that right at the edge of the Irish Sea, opposite Scotland. And he grew up near some of these ancient Celtic sites, a stone table, for instance, associated with Patrick, and ruined magnificent castles right on the edge of the sea, Dunluce Castle in particular. And all of these locations, these sites, these remains find their way into the Chronicles of Narnia. And the Giant's Causeway was an ancient giant's bridge to Scotland that the story said had collapsed, and so you find that in the Silver Chair and Dunluce Castle. You look at it and you read the description of Cair Paravel in the Chronicles of Narnia, and it's the castle of the kings and queens of Narnia, and of course the stone table on which Aslan was uh, put to death by the White Witch. And so these bits and pieces of childhood romance are the straw with which Lewis constructs an entirely new world.
Hmm. That makes sense. Now, you said this book again, Becoming C.S. Lewis, really starts when he's 9. That's when his mother died. Two
Yes.
part question, kind of, well, three part. What was she like? Why was she so remarkable? And how did that death affect him?
Mhm. Um, First of all, she was a brilliant woman. So in the 1880s, she took a first class degree in mathematics from Queen's College, Belfast. Very few women had college educations in the 19th century. Oxford University did not begin granting the degree to women until around 1920-21. So she was remarkable in that sense. The Hamilton family was a remarkable family. So a brilliant woman. Um, she devoted herself to her boys, um, and this comes through in the letters and the papers that that remain. They're all on in the archives at the Wade Center of Wheaton College. Um, but she would take the boys on vacations. Mr. Lewis was that sort of workaholic who couldn't imagine that he could take time off from his work. And so he just never went on vacation. It was he only went on a couple of vacations in his life, but she would take them uh, to the um, to the seaside, and uh, young Lewis developed a love of swimming. That was one of his lifelong loves. And so she took them to the zoo in London, and that love of animals that comes through in Animal Land, and then in the Chronicles of Narnia with the talking animals, began at an early age that she encouraged. She encouraged that, and so she was a great encouragement to the boys. But with her death, um, Lewis began to doubt the existence of a loving God. And that isn't stressed much in understanding Lewis's conversion, but he wrote about it in a letter to a friend that it was really her death that triggered his
Mm,
what became a commitment to atheism. How could a
wow.
all powerful, loving God let my mother die of cancer because she was
Mm.
so.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, you made another statement. The amount of ridicule and humiliation he experienced was, if not as significant, more significant to how he approached the problem of evil and suffering. So it sounds like, obviously, correct me if I'm wrong, his death of his mother triggered this move towards materialism, questions about the goodness of God. But the humiliation and ridicule and bullying he experienced, some of it tied to a disability that he had, and his lack of athletic ability just exacerbated that. Is that a fair way to put it? Unpack that for us.
Well, yeah, there were a number of dynamics going on there. Um, One of the things that characterizes humans is our ability to bend the thumb, and thus to advance with all sorts of tools, and um, sports depend upon the ability to grasp a ball, grasp a bat. So he was terribly clumsy. He couldn't use scissors, and little children cutting out things and making things out of paper. He struggled with that. Couldn't do it. So it resulted in a general clumsiness, not just with
Hmm.
the hands, but all in all. And of course, in our culture, in the English speaking world, if you're not good at sports, or if worse than that, if you can't do them at all, your life has no validity. You're taking up
Mm-hmm.
space that might be used by something more important, like an umbrella. So you have no right to exist. And so that was life as he experienced it. And he became quite antagonistic, antisocial. His brother and father feared that he might grow up to become an axe murderer. He was a perfect candidate.
Wow.
And so, that he withdrew into himself, became quite arrogant because he was smart, and so he used his
Mm-hmm.
his brains as his weapon, um, to defend himself and to criticize everybody else as being beneath him. So he became quite a nasty little boy. Um,
Mm.
but he was driven to that by the way he was treated by not being any good at sports. And that was the point at which his father finally decided to take him out of um, the school, Malvern College. This would be what we would call high school. At the age of 16, he went from Malvern College to the private tutoring by W.T. Kirkpatrick in England.
Mm. Well, I want to come back to Kirkpatrick and his influence on his life, but a few questions first. You had a real interesting section in the book about Jack's love for animals, and we
Hmm.
see this emerging early in his life, and of course being all over like the Narnia series and some of his later writings. So talk about some of the first signs we see of his love for animals.
Well, there were always pets at the house,
Hmm.
um, dogs and birds, and so he grew up loving animals, and of course, he was encouraged by his mother along those lines, and uh, so he would have missed them when he was away at school. He was deprived of his animals. Um, And part of him talking about those boyhood years as a wasteland. Part of that was the things that had stimulated his imagination earlier were no longer present in his life. The boarding school was a bit of a sterile environment, so he was deprived of that. But then when he went to live with Kirkpatrick, um, he had big blocks of time in the afternoon to go walking.
Hmm.
And he started walking 10, 15 miles a day
Wow.
across the countryside, just off across the countryside.
Hmm.
There are walking trails that have crisscrossed Britain for several thousand years, and those walking trails defy anyone's attempt at in asserting
Hmm.
property rights. You just walk across them by the because those paths have been there for thousands of years. So he would walk all over the place, and that part of England at that time was just honeycombed with all sorts of animals. It was still a time when the horse was the primary means of transportation. Um, Automobiles were just beginning to be seen, and primarily in the cities. You wouldn't see many out in the country. And ducks and geese and chickens and cows and
Mm.
everything else you can imagine um, were there. That was a part of his life, and the wild things, the wild animals that are still in the English countryside. Um, so his the countryside stimulated so much of that you see in the Chronicles of Narnia.
I enjoy the section in the book where you talk about friendships. And it seems like early in his life, apart from his brother, didn't really have any friends for a while. But his first real friend was Arthur Greaves. Expand on that stage pre-friendship, who Arthur was, and maybe how that relationship shaped him, and maybe even into what he writes later on love and friendship.
He became friends with Arthur Greaves during Easter vacation of 1914.
Hmm.
So he was almost 16 years old before he had a friend, if you can imagine. Think of that. Now, his brother, he loved his brother. He and his brother were very close, and they were best friends until Jack died, really.
Hmm.
But he had no other friend. And his experience at school, where he'd been ostracized, he encountered what he called the inner ring. And it's this, cabal of people who get their heads together and are better than others and control things, and they're the ringleaders. And you find it in every society, every community, every church has an inner ring. Uh, every college, university has an inner ring. Um, and he wrote an essay about it in the 40s, and then he included it in his last science fiction novel, That Hideous Strength. But that had been his experience of other people, and he was on the outside looking in. Um, he'd he developed a strong interest in Norse mythology in the years leading up to 1914, and was just fascinated with it. And Arthur Greaves was an older boy, the same age as Jack's brother Warnie, and he was a sickly boy. He was in poor health all of his life, and Jack and Warnie really didn't have much to do with him. They just weren't interested in him. He seemed to be they were looking down on someone
Hmm.
else. They would get a ring, and he was prevailed upon one day that Arthur was sick in bed to go by and visit him. Now, of course, they were polite. They'd seen each other, but they weren't friends. He went into the bedroom, and there, lying on the bedside table, was a book on Norse mythology.
Ah.
And Lewis looked at that and said, "You like that too?" And Greaves, you mean you do too? And that immediately formed the friendship that would last the rest of their lives. And so much of what we know about Lewis for the first 30 years of his life is because of the letters he wrote to Arthur every week um, to discuss what he was doing, what he was thinking, what he was feeling, what he was studying, what he was reading, what he was interested in, what he hated. And so we know all of this in detail because of that friendship.
So a couple things. First off, Lewis describes, I think in the Four Loves, but friendship is when you find something in common and you go like side by side with somebody
Yeah,
together. That's his famous. So clearly we see that going back to Arthur
yeah.
Greaves in a fascinating way. Um, let's talk about this question. You mentioned that his conversion later in life, and you tell that story in another book. You and I discussed that in some depth on an earlier video. But that
Mm-hmm.
was likely the result of a number of decisions made in his late childhood and adolescence. Now, there might
Mm-hmm.
be a ton of decisions, but maybe give us one or two or three early decisions that we see come into fruition later in life in his conversion that he made, obviously not knowing what they were going to lead to before he was a Christian.
Um, one of the most important things that happened was he changed his reading.
Hmm.
And this was a direct influence of Arthur Greaves and his father, for that matter. His father always encouraged him to read and better books than he had been reading. But Arthur introduced him to Jane Austen.
Hmm.
And also, they shared an interest in the Bronte sisters. And so, these great classic novels of the early 19th century. But what they are animated by is a deep um, Christian understanding of reality and life. Years later, he would say that the best apologetics is not little books about Christianity, but little books on every subject with the Christianity latent. And the novels of Jane Austen uh, are filled with latent Christianity. The Christian view of life is assumed on every page. And so he began reading these books. And then there was another kind of book that he discovered. All right, he and Greaves loved Norse mythology. One
Mhm.
of the 19th century writers who retold the stories of Norse mythology was William Morris. Morris was one of the great figures of the second half of the 19th century, not just in terms of novels, but also in terms of art. He was spearheaded the arts and crafts movement. He had factories that
Hmm.
produced wallpaper and tile, and any house that was built, after 1880 had William Morris wallpaper and tiles around the fireplaces. So Lewis wanted to read whatever Morris churned out, and one of the books that he read was The Well at the World's End. And
Hmm.
it's a story about the hero who journeys to the end of the world, endures great hardship and difficulty in order to attain the great thing. And once having attained the great thing, he returns home changed, a different person. Um, and he fell in love with this story, and he kept finding it in different places. And he went back to the original, which of course is the medieval tales of the quest for the Holy Grail, and then Spenser's The Fairy Queen. And what they are is allegorical stories of the Christian life, um, to sell all that you have in order to obtain the pearl of great price. And so he found that over and over. Then he found it in a modern writer. Well, he wasn't a modern writer, he was another 19th century writer, um, George MacDonald, in his tale Fantasies. And there it's the same thing. The hero is on this great quest, and so that tale that he fell in love with then became the basis for his career. After he
Huh.
graduated from college, he became a literature professor devoted to studying that particular period of writing, medieval, allegorical, courtly love poetry.
Hmm.
And that was his first great academic book that created his reputation, The Allegory of Love. But here's the thing, here's the problem with those stories. They're full of high values of truth and duty and obligation. And
Hmm.
he fell in love with these values, but a materialist has no place for values because
Hmm.
in a materialist world, there's nothing but brute
Wow.
matter, just matter and energy, no right, no wrong, no beautiful, no ugly, no true, no false. There's just what is. And so then he found himself in a state of cognitive dissonance. He was
Interesting.
pulled apart. He
Hmm.
loved stories and he thought them imaginary, and everything that he thought was real to him was just as dry as dust. And so that business of values and right and wrong would eventually become the key to his own conversion, Now, he wrote about it in Mere Christianity. The first part
Hmm.
of Mere Christianity is right and wrong is a clue to the meaning of the universe. And in that sense, those radio broadcasts were actually his testimony in the third person. He wasn't inventing an argument
Mm.
for the existence of God. He was explaining why he had become a believer and why he rejected materialism and believed there must be something behind the universe for this sense of right and wrong to come to us in a compelling way. And so that was the first big crack in his conversion. But it came from his pleasure reading. He
Mm.
wasn't studying this as a school subject. Um, he was doing it at nighttime.
That's so interesting. Through his friendship with Arthur Greaves, gives him a book, reads it, informs his sense of justice. And of course, you write in the book a lot of the injustice he experienced at the Wynyard school built in this sense of right and wrong deep to him. And when he comes
Yes.
out in Mere Christianity, that's how he starts the argument for God. Now, this is a side point, but I shared this with my wife. I just thought it was interesting that you mentioned how Lewis took issue with the way dwarfs were portrayed in Snow White. Why did he take issue with that? What was his difference with Disney? And what does this kind of tell us about C.S. Lewis that he would bother to even cite that disagreement?
Well, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs came out from Walt Disney in the mid '30s. J.R.R. Tolkien had just finished writing The Hobbit, and Lewis had been reading The Hobbit page by page as Tolkien wrote it. And Tolkien had also been writing these tales that nobody else knew about except Lewis of Middle Earth,
Mm.
and in which he explored elves and dwarves. And so Lewis already had in his mind what a dwarf was like. They were dangerous. Um, they were very intelligent. Um, they did not have much of a sense of humor. Um, and so, with the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the dwarves are comical figures, and Lewis was highly offended by that categorization of dwarves.
I love that. That's just funny to me that he would cite that, and that's the kind of thing that would offend him. Tells us how much those details, getting it right, matter.
Yes,
Lewis was an introvert, wasn't he?
he was. He was a shy person. He learned how to put on a public persona
Mm.
when he lectured. He was on stage and he performed, and he was larger than life, and he had a huge voice. Tolkien modeled the Ents on uh, Lewis and his booming voice, but one on one he was shy and uh, uncomfortable in social occasions.
Mm.
But that's why his friends meant so much to him, because this group of friends that he could be himself with, and he would come out of his shell and be comfortable with the Inklings, that literary group that he met with every week for
Mm.
years.
How tall was C.S. Lewis?
He was not a tall man, and this
Mm.
I always have to keep reminding myself of this, because I'm visualizing him as being over 6 feet, this great big man, but he's I think around 5'8", maybe.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's really interesting. Now, you
yeah.
mentioned earlier one of the key people in his life that also played a role in his materialism was Kirkpatrick at Oxford. So, who
hmm
is he? What role did he play, and how did he shape Lewis?
Kirkpatrick, W.T. Kirkpatrick, had been the headmaster of Mr. Lewis's um, boarding school in Ireland. And he had retired to be close to his son in Surrey, county to the southwest of London. Um, and what Mr. Lewis didn't understand was that Kirkpatrick himself had been on a journey and had wound up being a thoroughgoing materialist. He was an atheist, did not believe in God, had no room for all of that sort of um, fantasy. And he was, in terms of what exists, only those things we know with our senses can exist. Um, and so he gave Lewis an intellectual basis for his atheism. And Kirkpatrick was a great logician. He taught Lewis logic, how to think, how to take a problem apart, how to recognize assumptions and call them out, how to recognize presuppositions and sort them out of the real question at hand. So Lewis's intellectual skill really was formed by W.T. Kirkpatrick. Um, and Lewis was always grateful to him for that, but he also realized Kirkpatrick, was not a believer, and so that was sad.
Hmm. Very, very interesting. Now, as I read your book, part what I was thinking of is what surprises me here. So I didn't know he had a disability. I didn't know he had a friend till he didn't have a friend until he was 16 years old. I hadn't made the connection he was Irish and how that shaped him. What surprised you most? Because at this stage, you had already been studying C.S. Lewis for years, but maybe hadn't probed into the early years. What's one or two things that you just didn't expect to uncover that you did?
Oh goodness, there really was so much. I
Hmm.
mean, just an enormous amount that I didn't know about, because those years are glossed over on a few pages in the other biographies. Um, Goodness. Um, I think, well, what stood out was why I wrote the book in the first place, that the way so many of his ideas and preferences and outlooks on life, the things he enjoyed, the things he didn't like, were formed during those years, and they became
Mm.
the rails on which his conversion took place, on which his career as an English professor took place, and his career as an apologist, because it was those issues he was dealing with in those early years that would eventually form the basis of his primary um, overt apologetics in the problem of pain and mere Christianity.
Hmm. That's really
Um,
interesting. Just for those watching, I send the questions ahead of time, but I did not send you that one in terms of surprise. I can imagine there were just a ton of things that you came across. I bet the experience as a whole for you was like, oh, now I see why he talks about friendship this way. Now I
mhm,
see why he talks about love this way. Now I
mhm.
understand why he cares about justice, his love for animals. My guess is overall you're just connecting these dots and it just illuminated his life probably more than anything. Is that fair?
Yes, that is fair. That
Hmm.
is, and it's all through those years.
Okay. Now, there was a
Yeah.
section of the book I didn't expect, and I almost didn't ask you about this because I think some people might be like, why are you talking about this? And I'm sure you were debating including it in the book. There was a section called Forbidden Fruit, and it was about just this early, very unusual, bizarre sexual proclivities that C.S. Lewis had as a young man. You also hint that later in life he looks back at this when he was more mature and he was a Christian with a very different perspective. But to me, I read that, I'm like, okay, it just shows me that Lewis is human. He has struggles like anybody else. But maybe talk about that just as far as you're comfortable with and the lessons maybe we draw from it.
Okay. Yeah. And so in in our world, in the United States, boys and girls go to school together throughout grammar school, middle school, high school. They're in school together. And boys and girls get used to talking to each other, know something about one another. Lewis had virtually no exposure to females his own age,
Hmm.
period. I was
Hmm.
going to say
Yeah.
until. Yeah. When he finally got to Oxford, he would meet some, but they weren't in tutorials with him. I mean, so So it was all a mystery. It was all a mystery at that time in life when puberty begins and hormones are busting out all over. And he didn't know what in the world all of this was about and how it worked. And um, he didn't have Playboy magazine and what in the world is on the internet now. Goodness only knows.
Hmm.
And so, uh, yes, his fantasies were running wild during this period, and um, so he um, developed a fascination with um, what really it was a mild form of sadism, the Marquis de Sade's
Hmm.
bondage type of uh, fetish that lasted for a brief period, and he seems to have gotten over that fairly quickly once he got to Oxford. And one of the older fellows explained to him that's not normal.
Hmm. Hmm.
And yeah, it's part of the education of Jack Lewis. Um, but yeah, he just had no context for understanding, and he certainly never had a conversation with his father, and
Oh.
and he wouldn't have with W.T. Kirkpatrick.
Hmm.
And so, he's trying to figure it out all by himself.
That's such a helpful, gracious way to look at it. So you mentioned his father, Albert. Maybe for
Mhm.
a minute, just talk about who he was, how he shaped C.S. Lewis. That relationship obviously continued for a while. What was that dynamic?
I think the most important thing about Albert for who C.S. Lewis became is that Albert was the one, more than anyone else, who encouraged his reading.
Oh,
Um, he got it more from Albert than he ever got from school, because at that point, reading wasn't really a part of education unless you were reading Latin. Um, and there you weren't really reading for the story; you were reading to learn the parts of the Latin verb and nouns and adverbs. It had more to do with grammar, so there was no story. And so his father was always buying books, sending him books, and he had virtually an unlimited expense account when it came to books. And Albert lavished his sons with money. One reason he worked all the time was to
mm,
be able to support his boys. He did not have a personal fortune. And one thing that shocked Jack and Warnie when their father died was that there was hardly anything in the estate because he had been supporting his boys all their lives. He
wow.
continued to send an allowance to Warnie for 15 years after he entered the army so he could live the life of a gentleman officer. He continued to support Jack at Oxford as a student, and then extra money to get by on his beginning pay. So the money was virtually all gone by the time he died. He clearly loved his boys. He was very sentimental, and Jack didn't care for that. Neither did Warnie. And he wanted to be involved in his boys' lives, and they didn't want him to be, which is typical. That's not unusual. That's the way with young people want to be cut loose and free. But he just wanted to be in the thick of it, and he couldn't imagine that the boys would not want him to be right there in the middle of their lives. Of course, they want him to be helping them make their decisions and that sort of thing. But I think he was a lovely man. But his what drove Jack crazy about him was his tendency to confuse matters and reach illogical conclusions. His logic just defied logic, and so you see him doing that. Mrs. Moore, who was the mother of one of Jack's friends in officer training school, that Lewis took care of her after the friend died in the war. Lewis took care of her. She lived with him until her death in 1951. But she um, paralleled Albert in terms of illogical conversation and drawing ridiculous conclusions, as did Lewis's other great friend, Owen Barfield. Barfield was not a Christian. He was an anthroposophist, which is it's a philosophical evolutionary approach to God that Lewis called Gnosticism.
Hmm.
But anyway, Barfield was not trained in philosophy as Lewis had been, but fancied himself a philosopher and would reach all sorts of, um, of conclusions that Lewis tried to sort out and tried to explain to him the fallacy of his thought process, but it was to no avail. So that was one sort of thing that would drive Lewis absolutely mad.
Hal, I have so many more questions for you about C.S. Lewis. We didn't even get to the war, how that influenced his life. That's big, obviously. We didn't get to political views that C.S. Lewis had, but there's so many more. That's just going to encourage people to pick up your book that I thoroughly enjoyed, Becoming C.S. Lewis. And again, you do just such a great job of highlighting these early experiences and books and people that we see manifested later in his life. So if you want to know the untold story about C.S. Lewis, pick up his official name, just like C.S. Lewis had an official name, is Harry Lee Poe, and the title is Becoming C.S. Lewis. And you have two other books on C.S. Lewis that tell different stages of his life as well. We'll have you back on. We've talked about two of them. We'll have you back on to talk about the third in due time. But for the rest of you watching, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other interviews coming up you will not want to miss. And if you thought about studying apologetics, please consider joining me at Biola. These are the topics we have, and we're the top-rated apologetics program, fully distanced. We'd love to equip you. Information below. Hal, really appreciate you coming on, your enthusiasm for C.S. Lewis. You're just a guest I thoroughly enjoy. And let's do it again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.